Hello, I'm David Chooljian, and as a pulmonary and critical care physician, member of the bar in California, and a certified ethics consultant, it's my privilege to be talking to you today about a general overview of medical business ethics, where the white coat meets the white collar. Pertinent to that, I suppose, I don't have any financial conflicts of interest to disclose regarding the content of this presentation. There is a disclaimer that is associated with my bar membership, which is that while I'm presenting legal information, it is meant to be general education and should not be taken as advice for your specific or any specific legal case that may be at issue. In other words, I'm not your attorney. And so having gotten that out of the way, we can get down to what we'll be looking at today. So we'll start with, appropriately enough, some general ethical standards relating to medical business ethics and the overall business of medicine. Specifically, we'll begin with this idea of patient advocacy and us as physicians being advocates for our patients, and talk about whether that's still our primary interest. We'll look at conflicts with that interest, if it is indeed primary. And then we'll talk about the idea of the fiduciary and why physicians indeed should be considered fiduciaries and what the implications are of that. We'll then get into some pertinent legal standards that regulate how we conduct business in the medical sphere. We'll go over a number of pertinent standards. We'll talk about, as you can see here, anti-kickback, anti-self-referral, better known as the Stark Law. Talk about false billing and why the issue most of the time isn't that it's truly false. Look at the idea of medical business ownership and some reporting requirements that go along with that. And then lastly, the issue of gifts. So with that, the ethics of medical business. Traditionally, the role of the physician was to be an advocate. And indeed, some of my colleagues tell me that I put the fierce here, but a fierce advocate. For your patient's well-being and the fulfillment of their medical goals, as long as they're reasonable. And what that used to mean was that our role as an advocate was aligned with our financial incentives under the fee-for-service model. But there have been three major changes in the healthcare marketplace that may alter that equation. So one is that, of course, nowadays, more and more physicians are employees. Indeed, a number of years ago, the equation shifted so that the majority of med school graduates were actually employees rather than sole practitioners, small business owners, etc. And of course, there's the rise of the third-party payer. And although I don't cite it here, just a good general reference for you is the Social Transformation of American Medicine, Pulitzer Prize-winning book in the 80s by Paul Starr. Fascinating look at the rise of the third-party payer and, as a result, the rise towards cost containment and incentives for physicians to do so. And then lastly, the rise of corporate medicine in part in response to the rise of the third-party payer. And of course, then there are revenue generation incentives that go along with practicing medicine within a corporate body. Now, with those three changes comes this influence on the physician to instead act not as an advocate, perhaps, but as a gatekeeper of medical resources for multiple reasons and in multiple directions, actually. And you can see where there might be a conflict between the gatekeeper role and the fierce advocate role. And so looking at that, conflicts of interest, just the classic definition is here. And the idea is that we have a primary interest in the care of a patient, but there are secondary interests that we may have, including the conduct of our business. And that those secondary interests may come into conflict with the primary interest. Now, with that, a conflict of interest, it must be said, is not inherently bad, but it may create bias. And it's really the bias and the resultant changes in our behavior that we have to guard against here. Now, in situations where there's a disparity between parties in terms of their knowledge and experience and judgment that's related to a transaction or to an encounter, the conflicts of interest, the party that has the greater influence or the greater knowledge, are going to come under more close scrutiny. And in situations like that, there arises this idea of the more experienced, more knowledgeable party having to be a fiduciary. Now, as applied to physicians, a fiduciary is someone who acts in the best interest of the patient. And when those interests of the patient would conflict with the interest of the physician fiduciary or with third parties, hospitals, third-party payers, etc., then those secondary interests, right, are supposed to be subordinated to the best interest of the patient. Now, note that, of course, that means that you might need to say no to any one of the parties to a medical encounter, including the patient themselves. And so it gives rise to this idea that your standard of interacting with that patient is based not in this idea of caveat emptor, where it's an ordinary business transaction, the patient is merely a customer, and so it's incumbent upon them to find out what they need to find out to protect themselves in the transaction. Instead, it's based on trust fidelity. Now, it also, of course, means, right, that the customer is not always right, because if they're not a customer, right, then they're not always right. Now, with that, there's a higher standard of care to our patients, and therefore legal duties that we have to our patients. And we'll get into pertinent legal standards in medical business. However, I have to emphasize this. I emphasize it in all the courses I teach and a number of the ethics consultations that I perform, where the question seems to be depressingly commonly, oh, well, what does the law say, and what do I have to do under the law? And remember, the law sets a minimum standard of behavior. I would hope that we, as healthcare providers, are going to aspire to something other than just the minimum legal standard of behavior. Yeah. So with that said, let's look at a case. So in this case, you're a pulmonologist, you're in a group, and a 52-year-old white female comes in, lifelong non-smoker, but she has this dyspnea, and it's been there for quite a while, and she tells you, well, no one's been able to figure it out. So in part of your workup, you order a CAT scan of the chest, and your order is directed towards the radiology department of the university hospital down the street. It ends up being interpreted by their radiologist, who's an employee of that system. And it just so happens that you perform consultations at that hospital. And in part as a result of that, the hospitalists who work there, who are also employees of that system, will often refer patients to you. It turns out also that the office space that you and your group use is actually leased from the university that runs that hospital. And the rate associated with your use of that space hasn't increased in quite some time. Now, the patient comes looking like this after receiving the bill for the performance and interpretation of the CAT scan. And what happened to upset her so is that the insurer that she uses, who is actually the way that she had found it in the first place, says, well, the radiologist and indeed the radiology were out of our network. And so she receives a high bill. She does some checking around and finds that it's at least twice what she would have paid elsewhere in the community. And so she wants to know, well, why did you order the CAT scan to be done at that hospital? So looking at a pertinent legal standard here, the anti-kickback statutes. We'll begin with California. And we find in the pertinent part of California's statutory law in the Business and Professions Code that a kickback is this idea that when you have consideration, monetary or otherwise, that you either offer to someone or receive from someone, that would be considered a compensation or an inducement for referring a patient, even if you have some relationship, right, that would otherwise influence that referral, that consideration, the kickback, is unlawful. Now, there is a federal version of this, and the key element of the federal version, and indeed of the California version, is that there exist numerous so-called safe harbors. The idea that there are exceptions, if you will, right, to a situation where there would be a referral made and there might be something of value that's exchanged as a part of that transaction, or just in general in the background, but it's permissible. And so there's a number of examples here. Note pertinent to our case that space or equipment rentals between the entities that had a referral made are not considered to be an impermissible exchange. Of course, if there's a referral made within a system and the physician is an employee of that system, although it has to be meaningful employment, so they define there at least a year in term. Of course, there's going to be some special one-time transactions that are considered exceptions, like if you're selling your practice to the group that you've been engaged in referral with. And of course, if you refer to a large organization and they have publicly traded ownership interests of stock or other equities, then that's not considered, right, an impermissible kickback. Just a word at the end here about ambulatory surgical centers, because they get lots of attention in the law and in ethics. There's a lot of elements that need to be satisfied about the setup of those and how referrals occur. Well, the key that I've put here is the idea that every involved physician who has an interest, right, in that surgical center, they have to derive a significant proportion of their income, not the majority, but a significant proportion of their income from actually doing the procedure. So it's not just a shell. So there are a number of these safe harbors. If you don't find yourself in one, at least at the federal level, you're actually criminally liable, right, for accepting these considerations or offering these considerations in exchange for referrals. And so you really need to make sure that you find yourself within one of those, and your friendly neighborhood attorney can help you do that. So looking at our next case, there's this young man, 25-year-old Hispanic gentleman, comes in to be evaluated for this expiratory wheeze that he says started after he took his current job, which is as an aircraft mechanic. And his primary, who was the referring physician here, had performed basic spirometry, and it was unremarkable. Now, you order a bronchoprovocation study, and you order the study to be done at your group's wholly owned pulmonary function lab. It's done by a respiratory therapist that you employ, who applies some software that comes up with a basic interpretation that you then overread. Right? So you review the read and see if you agree with it or you edit it. Now, what ends up happening at this bronchoprovocation test is that the patient actually develops this intractable wheezing. Bronchodilators in an inhaled form, short-acting, are administered but don't relieve the wheezing. And the patient actually is instructed to go to the local emergency room. He does so, and at that emergency room gets additional inhaled bronchodilators as well as parenteral corticosteroids, feels better, does not need to be admitted to the hospital, and goes home. The perhaps ill-fated bronchoprovocation test here is ultimately read by one of your colleagues in the group because you're off attending a medical conference. These days, maybe in your own home. So the pertinent legal standard here, anti-self-referral, or the Stark law at the federal level. And so the pertinent part of the United States statutory code notes that if you're a physician and you make a referral, right, which, as you see in our example case, is really more of an internal order, for designated health services, you can't do so to an entity with which you or an immediate family member of yours have a financial relationship. Now, looking at what that constitutes, A financial relationship is any, of course, ownership interest or an investment interest or a compensation arrangement. Now, you may wonder, what about these designated health services? It's a pretty broad net. Note that it includes laboratory services, imaging services, procedures, hospitalization at an acute facility, etc. So designated health services is basically anything that a third-party payer, in this case Medicare, Medicaid, would be potentially paying for as a result of your order. Now, just like the safe harbors to the anti-kickback statute, there are exceptions to Stark, or the anti-self-referral. Just to note some of the key elements, you're okay in general if it's a referral for physician services and it's done by a physician in your same group. So here, the interpretation of the study is done by one of your colleagues in the group. The catch-all term for non-physician services is that if they're considered in-office ancillary services. Now, that doesn't have to be literally in the same physical office. It can be in the same building. It can be in another building that your group owns or contracts with, etc. There is a key there that if it's wholly owned, right, then you're more clearly within an exception in terms of ownership by your group. Of course, it's not considered impermissible referral due to a financial relationship if it's within a larger organization like an HMO. Note that given the rise of the physician employee, it's important to recognize that the terms of employment can't be influenced by the amount of internal referrals or the revenue that they generate, right? That can't be a direct element of the employment relationship. Again, like with the safe harbors, there's the exception for, in general, investment in a large entity that's publicly available. So everything is above board. You, again, find yourself in an exception if the referral is to an entity where you have privileges to perform the service, because then there's something else besides the financial relationship that would be influencing the referral. Again, note that renting space or equipment is not considered a compensation arrangement. And then as far as that goes, there is an interesting element within the Stark exceptions that takes into account the incentives that physicians are provided now to minimize cost. In essence, right, if your compensation arrangement with an entity that you refer to actually disincentivizes referrals in the interest of cost containment, then the financial relationship is actually not thought to be influencing referrals. So the structure of your financial relationship or your compensation arrangement in this case can be an exception in and of itself. So looking at our next case here. You have a pulmonary group practice, and last year you had a new pulmonologist just out of training that joined you. And you do this annual review of everyone's kind of productivity, what they're bringing to the practice, etc. And when it comes to this new colleague or newest colleague, you notice two interesting things. One is that they see substantially fewer patients than you and the rest of your more established colleagues. But then two is that their financial productivity is actually the highest in the group. So how do you account for that? Well, when you look in a little more detail, it turns out that the financial productivity may be arising from just the sheer volume of testing that this newest colleague is ordering within these fewer patient encounters. And so you look, and some examples include getting exhaled nitric oxide for every single patient who comes in with a reason for referral as chronic cough, and home oxygen evaluation for every single patient who comes in with a reason for referral of dyspnea. And that's actually regardless of how they hit the door in terms of their presenting vitals. Now, you bring this up kind of in casual conversation with every single one of your established colleagues, and universally they say, so what exactly is the problem here? We're generating revenue. The structure of our group is such that everybody's compensation is tied to the group productivity rather than individuals. So what is the problem? Well, in terms of the problem, right, it gets to this idea of false billing. Now, the False Claim Act, right, is what's pertinent here. There's both civil and criminal liability that it generates. And that civil liability can be pretty substantial in financial terms. In general, right, you're going to have a problem in violating this act if you knowingly present or cause to present a claim that is either false, truly false, where the services just didn't occur, which I would argue is pretty rare. It actually turns out that more commonly the violation would be a fraudulent claim, so-called Medicare or Medicaid abuse, where the services really weren't at the level that was claimed. Now, any arrangement, looking at what we have examined so far, that violates the Stark, self-referral, or the anti-kickback statutes is also a basis, right, where the False Claim Act could be violated. Now, note that the False Claim Act does allow for qui tam suits to be brought by an independent whistleblower, and there are a lot of them around. Right. Now, looking at a case pertinent to ownership, a college friend of yours contacts you saying, boy, I really want to get into investing in healthcare. I'm an accountant, but I'm looking to supplement my income. And as it happens, you and two of your physician colleagues have just decided to incorporate. You're going to create your practice as an S corporation. And you plan to offer nurse practitioners who are going to work with you an ownership stake as well. So 5 of you total. And your friend says, oh, okay, great. I'd like to invest in that to get some ownership shares. And I'll invest up to 25% of what you estimate the value of the practice is going to be. So some key elements about practice ownership in California. It has to be majority owned by a licensed physician or surgeon or a group of them. Allied health professionals can have an ownership, but it has to be limited to aggregate a minority stake. And you can't have owners who are non-medical and whole or part owners. The idea there is that you're not going to promote the unlicensed practice of medicine, right? So non-clinicians influencing professional judgment of physicians. Also in California, you're limited in the kind of corporation that you can establish. We won't get into the details of that. An S corporation would be permissible. With ownership can come some interesting requirements, particularly in the area of reporting. And so we're probably very aware of mandatory reporting that has to take place to the medical board in situations where there's a substantial judgment or settlement or arbitration award for you as an individual physician. However, it's important to recognize that settlement alone, not just judgment or arbitration award, has to be reported if the entity with which you're associated as an owner, employee, etc., is the one that was actually named as a party in the suit. On a related note, you have to report that as it relates to you as an individual physician, even if it was your employer who was judged to be at fault or pays the damages. So you always want to be aware of what these structures of ownership would require you to report to the medical board. And if you don't, then you're going to get fined. Now, financial interests also must be reported, but in this case, it's a report to the patient, right? And so if you have a relationship with a healthcare facility, upon your license renewal, you need to report that to the board, but going beyond that, you actually need to report that financial interest to any patient that you're referring to that health-related facility. And in so doing, you have to say, hey, I want you to recognize, patient, that you can go elsewhere. So that reporting the interest has to have a more meaningful element to it than just saying that the financial interest exists. Okay, and so our final case, a grateful surgeon here. So it's a 52-year-old general surgeon. He develops COP, and so you put him on long-term corticosteroids, and thankfully the COP gets better. However, because he's on long-term corticosteroids for at least a year, he gets all sorts of side effects, weight gain, pathological fracture, can't stand for long periods of time, etc. And on the last day, right, of the gradual step down in that corticosteroid therapy, he brings in this expensive wine and cheese basket to you as the pulmonologist. At that same visit, he asks you to fill out a form for his disability insurance and wants it to say that he won't be able to perform surgeries for the foreseeable future because of either his disease or the therapies for it, or both. So let's look at the ethics and law relating to giving gifts, you as a physician giving gifts. Okay, well, the gift, right, if it's to another physician, for example, or any other entity that can influence the referral of patients, that could be a kickback, right, under our aforementioned legal standard. And note that that includes giving gifts to patients themselves, because they're in a position, right, to influence referral. Now, the Office of Inspector General at the Federal Health and Human Services level has said, well, look, we're going to try to be a little bit reasonable about this. If the gifts are just of nominal value, and so as of 2016, these were the amounts, then it's likely acceptable under anti-kickback statutory enforcement, even though there's not something in the statute that gives an exception for that. Now, regardless of amount, right, you can't give cash. You can't give cash equivalents, right? These days, of course, gift cards would be the most pertinent of that. And so in as much as we tend to obsess a little bit more about receiving gifts, in the case example is about receiving gifts, we do have to think about the gifts that we give, especially within our business role. Now, the receipt of gifts. Okay, let's look at two broad categories here. Gifts from patients, like the case we were given. Things that you have to examine in terms of whether or not receiving and using personally the gift is appropriate. You have to look at proportional value, and that's proportionate not only to you and the services that you've rendered, where you say, oh, wow, I really didn't do a whole lot for this patient, but they're giving me something really valuable. Or you can and should look at the proportional value relative to the patient's overall financial situation, to the extent that you're aware of it, right? It's if it's a patient that has like housing pressure, and yet they give you, these expensive tickets to a baseball game, you really say, oh boy, that was actually a big chunk of their disposable income. So what are they trying to achieve here? Now, on that note, you really have to see whether or not there's going to be an appearance that your medical judgment is being influenced, or they're trying to influence your medical judgment. The AMA notes that you can consider redirecting this gift-giving urge towards a charity, but it can be problematic if that charity is actually the charitable arm of your employer, like a university. And so you want to be careful in redirecting in that way, especially if you stand to benefit from it in some indirect but personal way. Now, gifts from industry. It used to be pre-Sunshine Act that we obsessed about this a lot more. Note that, Sunshine Act, the open payments page has been available for a while. But it really turns out that perception is probably the more significant issue when it comes to the receipt of gifts from industry. There's been studies like the one cited here where patients really believe that it does have more of an influence than even physicians do. And so patients become aware of gift receipt from industry in whatever form, that can really kind of besmirch you as an individual and the profession as a whole. So in summary, what have we covered? The ethical standards relating to medical business. Simply put, you should consider yourself a fiduciary, where the acting in the best interest of your patient is your foremost duty. As a result, then you can't treat the patient merely as a customer, parlance of our times aside. In terms of legal standards, we looked at the anti-kickback statute. You really avoid violating that in general by referring based on quality first and foremost. And you really need to know what your relationships are with the entities that you provide referrals to or receive referrals from. On a related note, there's the anti-self-referral idea, Stark, and you really do want to look at your safe harbors when it comes to that. And just like with anti-kickback, your friendly neighborhood attorney can navigate those waters with you. The idea of false billing we looked at, and it's really more commonly excessive billing. Note that saying, well, I needed to practice defensive medicine is actually not a defense in and of itself to that. In terms of ownership of a medical business and reporting requirements, you do need to know your ownership structure, which is something that physicians in general are not well versed in on the basis of our training or via our training. And take the renewal of your license as an opportunity to review what reporting you need to engage in, as often it's tied to that. And lastly, in terms of gifts, giving and receiving, just remember, perception may actually be more important than the reality of how influential the gift is or may be. And so with that, key references, I'll just direct you to the Bander Center at St. Louis University, probably the most fully fleshed out online resource that you'll have about medical business ethics, although of course CMS, AMA, and Medical Board of California all have key references as well. And with that, I will take questions, comments, concerns, hopes, dreams, wishes, or desires regarding this topic in the Q&A to follow. Thank you for your attention.